The last slide had barely faded from the screen when the room broke into soft claps. Alara nodded once in polite acknowledgement, then started gathering her notes. The women from the Education Council lingered, murmuring compliments, words like precise, impressive, actionable. But she moved with quiet efficiency, packing her materials without fanfare. She had no interest in praise. Her work was about outcomes, not applause. She stepped into the hallway heels, muted on the polished floor, and slipped her phone out of her blazer pocket to check the time. That's when it vibrated. One new message. From Mom. She hesitated before unlocking the screen, her thumb hovering like it already knew what waited behind that digital curtain. Please don't come to the wedding, Alara. You've always sided with your father. I need a fresh start. That was it. No greeting, no signature, not even a line break. Alara stared at the message as a strange, almost detached calm washed over her. Not sadness, not anger, just a kind of sharp clarity that settled deep like frost forming on glass. She stood still in the corridor, the buzz of muted conversations from other rooms fading into the distance. Her shoulders relaxed. She let out a slow breath. Then she walked unhurried, composed down the hall to the end office where her laptop waited on a side table. She closed the door behind her, sat down and opened the machine with practiced ease. Her fingers didn't hesitate. No trembling, no second thoughts. She clicked into a private folder labeled Halwyn Estate, Sponsorship Docs. Scrolled, found the file, opened the original sponsorship agreement. Read Clause 6.3 like she'd memorized it months ago. Donor reserves right to withdraw sponsorship without notice in the event of ethical or relational conflict. She opened a new email. To Venue Director, Halwyn Estate. Subject withdrawal of sponsorship. The cursor blinked. She typed, effective immediately. STEM Equity Trust withdraws its sponsorship for the Cartwright-Winslow wedding event, scheduled at your venue on date. Please halt all vendor activity and rescind event access associated with the account. Regards, Alara Winslow, Director of Programs, STEM Equity Trust. She hit send. Then she closed the laptop and sat in silence for a moment. She could hear a faint hum of air conditioning and the distant clicking of someone else's heels in the hall. The world hadn't changed, but something inside her had locked into place, firm, final. It hadn't always been this way. There was a time when Alara would have spiraled from a message like that, rereading it late at night, picking it apart for hidden meaning, wondering what she'd done wrong if she was somehow still the problem. But those days were long behind her. She had built a life where peace was earned, not granted, where clarity cost years but came clean in the end. Alara Winslow was 30, unmarried, quiet by nature. A former scholarship kid turned nonprofit executive now running a national initiative funding STEM education for girls who reminded her of herself. She wasn't flashy, didn't do magazine spreads or gala speeches, but when she moved, things moved, behind the scenes, without credit, including until 5 minutes ago her mother's entire wedding venue. What Vienna didn't know and would likely never bother to ask was that the very hall she'd chosen for her second chance ceremony, the grand Halwyn Estate with its white stone archways and imported glass chandeliers, had been paid for in full by Alara's team. Anonymous funding through the trust based on a proposal from the venue that never named Vienna directly. It had seemed almost poetic at the time, sponsoring a female empowerment event hosted by a woman who once drained her husband's retirement fund and blamed her teenage daughter for choosing the parent who stayed. Alara hadn't done it for reconciliation. She certainly hadn't planned to attend, but some small part of her, some quiet, still voice had wanted to believe that maybe helping her mother quietly, generously, without acknowledgement, might mean something, might loosen a knot neither of them could name. Instead, Vienna sent a text. No warmth, no gratitude, just a boundary disguised as moral high ground. You've always sided with your father. Alara smiled without humor. If siding with the man who never walked out made her unwelcome, so be it. She stood, gathered her things, and walked back out into the late afternoon sun. The air was cool for June. The wind tugged at the edge of her jacket as she crossed the street toward the parking lot, phone tucked away again, forgotten. In the distance, a church bell rang. 4 o'clock. By this time, tomorrow, 200 guests would be standing in front of locked gates at Halwyn Estate, wondering what went wrong. And Vienna would finally have to explain something without anyone else to foot the bill. Not that Ilara planned to be there. Some exits don't need an audience. Ilara was 17 when the world split in two. It was a Tuesday. She remembered that because the kitchen still smelled faintly of Monday's leftover chili and because Tuesday was the day her mother wore silk. Not for them, never for them, but for someone else, someone she was always meeting for drinks or running into by accident at the Hyatt bar downtown. The silk dress that night was cobalt blue, a shade that caught the light like water. Vienna stood by the sink applying lipstick from a gold compact, completely unbothered by the fact that she'd asked both her husband and daughter to sit down at the table without explaining why. Ray sat stiffly across from Ilara, fingers laced together on the laminate surface. He looked older than he had just days earlier, grayer around the edges like something was wearing him down from the inside. Ilara could feel it before anyone said a word, that tight, silent tension that made her stomach ache. Vienna snapped the compact shut. "I'm leaving." The words landed like a plate sliding off a shelf. Not shattering, not loud, just inevitable. Ray didn't speak at first. He blinked once, slowly, then looked down at his hands like maybe the answer to everything was hidden in the creases of his skin. "For how long?" he asked quietly. Vienna sighed. "Permanently." Ilara felt her chest tighten. "You mean, like a separation?" "No," Vienna said, and turned to grab her purse. "I mean, I'm done." Ray pushed his chair back just a little, the legs scraping the floor in protest. "Is there someone else?" Vienna didn't even flinch. "There's always someone else, Ray, that's the point." It was the kind of line Ilara would remember forever, not just because of the cruelty behind it, but because of how easily it came out, like it had been rehearsed in the mirror between coats of mascara. Vienna had been seeing a man named Bryce for at least 6 months. He owned a string of boutique gyms and had a Porsche and a habit of texting her at dinner. Ilara had known even if no one said it out loud. You could tell by the way her mother smiled at her phone by how she suddenly had opinions on protein smoothies and started working late at pop-up charity events she couldn't describe. Ray stood now slowly. "We built a life together, Vienna." Vienna looped her purse over her shoulder. "You built a life?" "I tolerated it." She walked toward the door heels, sharp against the tile. "You were never ambitious enough, never bold. Everything was always careful with you, safe." Ilara wanted to speak, to ask her to stay, or at least to explain, but the words felt stuck. Her mother wasn't looking at her. She hadn't, not once during this entire exchange. Ray, still calm, somehow said, "What about the money?" Vienna finally paused, one hand on the doorknob. "It's gone." "What do you mean it's gone?" "I moved it last week. Into a private account. I told you we needed liquidity for the remodel. You should have paid more attention." Ray's face didn't change much, but Ilara saw his knuckles whiten. "That was my retirement." Vienna shrugged. "You're still teaching? It's not like you don't have time to start over." Ilara stood now, too, unsure of what she was supposed to do. "Mom," Vienna turned. For the first time, she actually looked at her daughter. "I'm not asking you to understand. I'm asking you to grow up." That was it. That was the goodbye. She didn't hug Ilara. She didn't say she loved her. She didn't ask if she was okay. She opened the door and walked out into the night air like she was going to brunch, like nothing about this moment would matter. 2 hours from now. The porch light flicked on automatically behind her as she stepped off the stoop and into Bryce's waiting car. Ilara stood frozen by the table. Ray didn't cry. He didn't scream. He walked over to the fridge, opened it, and pulled out the container of leftover chili. Then he turned on the stove and reheated it, like they still had dinner to eat. That night, Ilara lay awake in her twin bed and listened to the sound of silence stretching through the house. She realized she would never see her mother the same way again. Not as a woman, not as a parent, not as anything permanent. She was a flash, a beautiful, fast-moving thing that left scorch marks when it passed. She chose to stay, not because she was loyal, Not even because she was angry, but because Ray was still there and someone had to help clean up the mess Vienna left behind. It wasn't the last time Vienna would disappear. It was just the first time Alara understood that love, for some people, is optional and entirely conditional. She learned something that night about people, about silence, about what it means to be left behind and still choose to stand. The house felt too big after Vienna left. The hallways echoed more, the walls looked duller without her framed art and floral throws. But it wasn't sadness that lingered. It was vacancy. A silence that didn't ache exactly but hummed with all the things left unsaid. Alara and Ray adapted in their own quiet way. They sold the guest bedroom furniture and turned it into a study so Alara could do homework and Ray could correct essays. They canceled cable, ate more canned soup, drove the same sedan until it wheezed on cold mornings. They made do. The divorce was finalized quickly. Vienna had good lawyers and little patience for drawn-out settlements. She took the Audi and most of the savings. Ray kept the house. He never contested the terms, even when Alara asked why. You can't make someone stay where they don't want to be. He told her, folding laundry like the world hadn't just split in half. Fighting only keeps you standing in the wreckage longer. Within months, Vienna had moved into a sleek condo on the 23rd floor of a downtown high-rise. Alara had seen photos online, Vienna standing on a balcony in a designer dress champagne in hand, captioned, "New beginnings and elevated views." She became a regular feature in local social pages, attending art galas, speaking at wellness panels, hosting fundraisers for vague causes. She was suddenly Vienna Winslow empowerment consultant. It was branding genius, really. She crafted a narrative so clean it sparkled how she'd bravely left a stagnant life and was now helping other women reclaim joy. There were no mentions of the retirement account. No references to Bryce, who vanished a few months after the move. No photos of Ray. And certainly none of Alara. At 19, during Alara's sophomore year of college, she decided to try. She told herself enough time had passed that maybe beneath all the curated reinvention, her mother still had room for a daughter. Alara found Vienna's email on a public coaching site and sent a short message. Polite, careful. She included a graduation photo and a line that said, "I hope you're doing well. I'd like to reconnect." A week later, she received a reply. But not from Vienna. From someone named Maribel, her executive assistant. "Ms. Winslow is currently unavailable for personal communications. Thank you for your message." That was all it said. Alara read it 3 times, then closed her laptop without responding. They didn't speak again. Not on birthdays, not on holidays, not when Alara was named a finalist for the National Women in STEM Award, not when Ray had a mild heart attack, not when Alara published her first piece in the Journal of Educational Equity. The silence was never declared, it was simply sustained. Over time, the silence stopped feeling like punishment and started feeling like proof. Proof that Alara had made the right decision staying with the parent who showed up for casseroles and car trouble for report cards and tax season. Ray didn't know how to say things like, "I'm proud of you in fancy ways," but he showed up at every presentation and brought coffee to every late-night study crunch. He drove 5 hours to see her first apartment and fixed her leaky kitchen sink with a wrench so old it might have belonged to his father. Meanwhile, Vienna's version of the story hardened like lacquer. In her new circles, Ray had been the problem, a controlling, small-minded man who'd stifled her dreams. Alara was the brainwashed daughter who had chosen the easier parent. Vienna spoke about the importance of breaking free from toxic ties, but she never specified which ones. She didn't have to. The applause came anyway. Occasionally, Alara would hear secondhand updates through distant relatives or old neighbors. "Saw your mom in that women's conference thing. They had her in a red jumpsuit on stage talking about transformation." Or, "She donated to the new yoga dome at the community center." "Did you know Alara always answered the same way? That's nice." Then she changed the subject. It wasn't bitterness that kept her distant. It was clarity. She'd watched her mother rewrite history in real time, replacing pain with polish, swapping out memories like home decor. Vienna didn't lie maliciously, she lied with intent, because truth was messy and Vienna didn't do messy. She did angles, she did captions, she did reinvention. Alara did the work. She graduated early, started teaching workshops for underrepresented girls in science, earned a grant, built a program, scaled it. She stayed small on the outside. No interviews, no spotlights, but big where it mattered. By 28, she was managing a 7-figure trust for STEM equity. And by 30, she had become the kind of woman Vienna only pretended to be. Still, the silence stretched on. 2 lives, 2 homes, 1 story told 2 very different ways. And Alara had learned that sometimes silence isn't what's missing. It's what protects you from being rewritten. The afternoon inbox scan was usually uneventful. Alara worked with quiet precision reading grant proposals, reviewing progress reports, checking in on scholarship disbursements. The STEM Equity Trust had grown into a national name over the past 5 years, and as director of programs, she now spent most days managing impact metrics and fielding high-level funding requests. It was work that fed her measured, meaningful, mostly free of ego. Just numbers, stories, futures. She had just finished annotating a quarterly report from a robotics pilot in Minnesota when a new request popped up. A PDF attachment. Subject line: venue sponsorship inquiry, event proposal, the Halwyn estate. She clicked it without thinking. The file opened smoothly, standard language, polished formatting. A luxury venue was requesting partnership for an event they described as a modern celebration of legacy love and female renewal. The phrasing was typical of high-end wedding pitches, but Alara's attention then froze on the event title itself, Cartwright Winslow. Wedding June 15th. The Halwyn Estate. The cursor blinked at the top of the screen. Winslow. She stared at the name for a full 10 seconds, every other word fading from view. Cartwright she didn't know, but Winslow, it wasn't a coincidence. People didn't just attach that name to weddings by chance. And no one, absolutely no one in her extended family was currently engaged. Not unless... Her stomach turned slow and deliberate as her mind stitched the rest together. Vienna. It had to be. She sat back in her chair, the edges of her vision sharpening. She hadn't heard her mother's name in months, not since a distant cousin tagged Vienna in a photo from a beach house birthday in Santa Barbara. No context, no caption, just Vienna in white linen glass in hand, smiling like the past had never existed. Alara had scrolled past without pausing, and now here she was, again appearing, not as a message or a headline, but in a formal funding proposal. A wedding. Vienna was getting married, and Alara was the one being asked to underwrite it. She scanned the file again. No personal names were included in the contact fields, just Bride W. Winslow and partner G. Cartwright. The coordinator's email was from Halwyn Events. The $500,000 request was classified under venue partnership. Anonymous sponsorships available. The planner had marked the event as aligned with brand goals for female empowerment and intergenerational celebration. The irony was almost laughable. Vienna now branding herself as a woman of transformation, standing at the altar again in a gown no doubt stitched with selective memory. And here was Alara, unknown, unread, quietly, being asked to foot the bill for her mother's new beginning. She could have denied it on the spot, marked the proposal as ineligible due to conflict. She had that authority. No one else needed to weigh in, but she didn't. Instead, she picked up the phone and buzzed her assistant. Danielle, I need full logistics on the Halwyn proposal, she said evenly. Venue, history vendor, roster, media plan, anything tied to the event. Sure, Danielle replied. It's a wedding, right? Cartwright Winslow. Yes. Looks like they're trying to pitch it as a woman-forward showcase. Of course they are, Alara said softly. She ended the call and stared out the window for a while. The sky outside her office stretched wide and pale. Across the street, scaffolding framed a building in progress, messy steel beams becoming something useful. It reminded her why she did what she did. Girls who needed structure. Girls who built instead of posed. Back on screen, she reopened the Hallwin file. Toward the bottom was a single line that stood out like a whisper donor may opt to remain anonymous. That made her pause. She wasn't sure what part of her made the next move curiosity, irony, something deeper. But after a minute, she opened a new draft and typed, STEM Equity Trust is open to providing venue sponsorship under the following conditions. 1. Sponsorship remains anonymous. 2. All press materials must omit donor affiliation. 3. Vendor coordination goes through designated liaison only. She hit send before she could talk herself out of it. Then she sat back and exhaled. Maybe it was petty. Maybe it was poetic. Maybe it was both. She didn't want recognition, didn't want reconciliation. She wasn't trying to reconnect. But maybe in some twisted orbit of fate, she could stand at the very center of her mother's curated reinvention and say nothing. Be the quiet scaffolding that made the whole thing look solid from afar. She wouldn't attend. That much she knew. But she'd pay. And when the moment came, if it came, she'd remember exactly what was hers to give. And exactly what could be taken back. The Hallwin estate sat 30 minutes outside the city, nestled among cypress trees and gently sloping hills. It had the kind of timeless charm that screamed old money-stone archways, wrought iron balconies, a reflecting pool shaped like a violin. Ilara had seen the photos in the proposal, but the real thing felt surreal. Too pristine, too theatrical, like a place built not for marriage, but for magazine spreads about marriage. She arrived unannounced, opting for a midweek site tour listed under prospective donor using only the trust's name. No one questioned her. That was the magic of being associated with funding. People welcomed you without needing to know who you were. The event planner was a woman named Jolene, effortlessly polished in flats, and a navy blazer hair pulled into a tight chignon that never moved even in the breeze. She met Ilara at the main courtyard, hands clasped with the kind of enthusiasm that came from commissions and curated optimism. "We are so thrilled to have STEM Equity Trust involved," Jolene gushed as they walked the perimeter. "This is going to be one of our most elegant events this season. The bride is very style-forward, very intentional." Ilara offered a neutral smile. "We like to support intentional women." Jolene didn't catch the edge in her voice. "Exactly. In this bride, she's been through a lot. Second marriage, complete reinvention. She's really taken control of her narrative. You can tell." Ilara glanced toward the tent being installed across the lawn, cream-colored draping chandeliers still in crates nearby. "What's her name again?" "Vienna Winslow," Jolene said. "She's marrying Grant Cartwright, real estate mogul. They're quite the couple. Stylish, but grounded. Vienna has this energy like she's always known what she deserves. She's rebuilt herself." Ilara said nothing, just kept walking. The ceremony would take place at the edge of the water with guests facing the hillside. Rows of chairs were already marked with brass stands for floral arrangements. In one corner, a team was testing lighting angles for sunset. Everything gleamed with purpose, and her daughter Ilara asked casually, keeping her tone light. Jolene hesitated just long enough to reveal more than she intended. "Not involved. Some kind of family tension, I think. It's a delicate subject. But Vienna's made it clear this wedding is about new chapters." Ilara let that sit between them. She watched a worker lay white stones along the walkway, each one placed with surgical precision. She wondered what kind of woman her mother had become in this curated reality, one who erased what didn't fit the frame, one who wore reinvention like perfume. They entered the main hall next where the reception would take place. The room was vast arched ceilings, gold-trimmed sconces, marble floors polished to a mirror shine. A long head table had already been marked off on the floor plan, taped to the wall. "We'll have floral runners cascading over this edge," Jolene said, pointing. "Soft, rose gold, and ivory. It's going to look like a royal garden." Ilara scanned the rendering. Her eyes caught the placement of Vienna's name in script, Vienna Winslow Cartwright, already hyphenated, already etched into the future. "She's very involved in the details," Ilara asked. "Oh, absolutely. She has a clear vision. She keeps saying she wants it to feel earned." Earned. That word landed like a pebble dropped in a well. Alara turned away from the wall and walked toward the open windows. Outside, the breeze lifted one of the tent flaps. The whole scene was picturesque, a fairy tale being staged with corporate funding and artificial grace. She's requested anonymity regarding sponsorship, Jolene continued. Does that work for your organization? Alara kept her voice even. That's our preference. Jolene smiled, clearly relieved. Wonderful. We always respect donor discretion. As they finished the tour, Jolene handed her a leather-bound packet with the updated event timeline and vendor list. We'll have press coverage, but only from approved outlets. No names unless authorized. And of course, no mention of your trust unless you indicate otherwise. Perfect, Alara said. On the drive back, she didn't turn on the radio. Just silence. Miles of open road stretched in front of her, smooth and sun-warmed. She thought about the planner's words. She's really taken control of her narrative. That's what Vienna had always done. Not fix, not apologize, just rewrite. She'd built a version of her life in which Alara didn't exist. Not in the photos, not in the speeches, not in the planning. Her own daughter, invisible but still underwriting the illusion. Alara didn't need to be seen, not for this, but she would be felt. Not through vengeance, not through sabotage, just by holding the one thread her mother didn't know was hers, the venue, the money, the foundation, under all that white. The text came on a Thursday afternoon, a week before the wedding. Alara was in line at a small corner cafe waiting for her usual iced coffee when her phone buzzed in her coat pocket. She didn't check it right away. The line was moving slowly and she was preoccupied reviewing a partner report from the Wisconsin Girls in Engineering camp. It wasn't until she reached the sidewalk, cup in hand, that she glanced at the screen. This is my day. I don't want it tainted by resentment. Don't come. Mom. No greeting. No context. Not even her name. Just 6 short sentences, spaced, like she was trying to sound composed, like she was being reasonable. Alara stopped walking. The people on the sidewalk passed by in streams of blurred motion, bundled in scarves and headphones. She stood still, reading the message again, this time slower. She felt nothing at first. Not confusion, not hurt. Just the strange weight of recognition, like walking into a room that looks different but still smells like home, that same old tone, that same old self-narration. Vienna wasn't disinviting her. She was casting herself as the victim in advance. I don't want it tainted, as if Alara were a flaw in the silk of the day. By resentment. As if resentment were some baseless emotion Alara had clung to without cause. Not a word about history, not a breath of acknowledgement. Just the performance of peacekeeping from the woman who had caused the war. Alara didn't reply. She walked 3 more blocks, finished her coffee, and dropped the cup into a recycling bin with quiet finality. Then she headed home, boots thudding softly on the concrete. By the time she stepped into her apartment, the sun was dipping low over the skyline. She didn't bother turning on lights. She moved by memory through the warm dusk glow, dropping her keys on the entry table, sliding off her coat, settling into the chair near the window. The city outside was buzzing traffic, humming windows, blinking on the living rhythm of people preparing for dinners and shows and dates. Alara sat still in her chair, the phone still in her hand, the screen gone dark. Her mother was getting married. She had built an entire narrative around transformation. And still, she couldn't face the person she had left behind without framing it as damage control. No call, no letter, no voice even now. Just a single message in a thread that hadn't been touched in years. Vienna had made her decision not with cruelty but with detachment, which somehow stung worse. That night, after she'd changed into a soft sweater and eaten half a salad she couldn't finish, Alara opened her laptop. She didn't rush. She moved slowly, methodically, like muscle memory. She went into the secured folder labeled Halwyn, Private. Clicked open the sponsorship contract. Scrolled down her eyes, finding the clause she'd reread once before, back when this all felt like ironic justice instead of something sharp. 6.3, Termination Clause. The donor may terminate sponsorship without notice or liability if the event becomes misaligned with the donor's ethical or relational values. She read it 3 times, then closed the laptop gently. Still no anger, still no heat, only clarity. This wasn't about revenge. This wasn't about teaching Vienna a lesson. That assumed Vienna was willing to learn. Ilara knew better now. Her mother didn't change, she rebranded. She had once drained her husband's retirement account and walked out with a man in a Porsche. She had once looked her 17-year-old daughter in the eye and said, "Grow up." Now she stood before 200 guests swathed in florals and curated backstories claiming she had built herself. What Vienna never understood was that Ilara had too. Just without the spotlight, without the shortcuts, without the benefit of revisionist grace. And maybe it was time her mother learned what it felt like when someone quietly stepped out of frame and took the foundation with them. Ilara didn't decide that night, not with finality. She didn't draft the email or call the coordinator, not yet. But she did something that, for her, meant more. She deleted the text, not to forget it, but because she didn't need to read it again. She already knew how it ended. The diner hadn't changed. Same vinyl booths, same crooked specials board with fading red marker, same smell of burnt coffee and griddle oil that clung to the ceiling like old wallpaper. Ilara slid into the booth by the window, the one they'd claimed as theirs since she was in high school, the one where her father always insisted on sitting with his back to the door. "So I don't get distracted by people walking in," he used to say. Ray arrived 5 minutes late, which for him was practically early. He wore a windbreaker over his button-down the collar, slightly turned hair grayer than last year, but still neatly combed. He smiled as he sat down, placing his reading glasses on the table like he always did, even though he rarely used them, unless there was a menu with small print. "You already order?" he asked. Or he. "Just water," Ilara said. He waved at the waitress behind the counter. "Hey, Margie, can I get my usual?" She gave him a thumbs up without looking up from the register. "You really think she remembers what that is?" Ilara teased. Ray chuckled. "She's got a better memory than I do." They sat in an easy silence for a moment. Not awkward, just familiar. The kind that comes when 2 people don't need to fill space with sound. After a while, Ray reached for the sugar shaker and started tapping it against his palm, so he said, glancing at her over the rim of his glasses, "You mentioned something about Vienna." Ilara kept her tone neutral. "She's getting married. Again." Ray's eyebrows lifted slightly, then settled. "Ah, to someone named Grant Cartwright, some real estate guy. I only know because a colleague mentioned it in passing. He didn't ask how involved Ilara was in that passing mention. He never pried, unless she invited him in. Well, he said after a beat, I hope she got a prenup this time. If he's smart, so did he." Ilara smiled faintly. Ray leaned back, arms crossed loosely. "You know, I used to think people like her just needed more time. That maybe she'd grow into herself, but she didn't. She just got better at pretending. People like her don't build anything. They just decorate the surface." Ilara looked down at her napkin, folded it once, then again. "I think she believes she's changed," she said. "Or at least wants people to believe it." Ray shrugged. "Reputation and redemption aren't the same thing." The waitress came by with their plates, his with scrambled eggs, turkey bacon, wheat toast, hers with a Greek omelet and a side of fruit. The fruit was always underripe, but it gave her something to pick at while they talked. "She sent me a text last week," Ilara said after a while. "Told me not to come." Ray didn't react right away. He cut into his eggs with deliberate slowness. "Did she say why? Something about not wanting the day tainted by resentment?" Said, "I always took your side." Ray smirked. "I didn't know this was still a custody battle." "It's not. Not really, but she wants it to be." Ilara nodded. She likes being the one who's wronged. They ate in silence for a few minutes. A country song hummed softly from the overhead speaker, some dusty voice singing about backroads and promises. Outside, the wind kicked a napkin across the parking lot. "You know," Ray said eventually, wiping his mouth with a paper napkin, "you don't owe her anything. Not attendance, not understanding, not forgiveness on her timeline." "I know." He looked at her, then really looked. "But you're still carrying it." Ilara met his eyes. Not as much as before. He nodded. That's something then. They finished their meal. Ray paid no attention to his phone, never checked it during their talks. Ilara always appreciated that. He made her feel like the center of the room, even in a place full of cheap syrup and louder conversations. When the check came, Ilara grabbed it first. I got it, she said. Ray raised an eyebrow. I taught you to let other people pay sometimes, and I ignored that lesson like most teenagers. He let her. Didn't argue, just smiled. As they stood to leave, Ilara hugged him. Not the casual kind, the longer grounding kind. The kind that holds a little more meaning than words can carry. Ray patted her back gently. You okay? Yeah, she said. Just ready to be done, pretending I'm not. They walked out into the parking lot together. The sky was overcast, the kind of gray that softened everything without making it dull. Ilara got into her car and sat there for a moment after Ray pulled away his taillights, fading into traffic. She didn't cry. She just breathed slow and full, like someone preparing to make a move that wouldn't be undone. Saturday morning came in quietly. No meetings, no urgent calls, no alarms set, just the hum of traffic, 6 stories below, and the faint tap of branches brushing her window. Ilara stood barefoot in her kitchen, waiting for her kettle to boil, holding her phone without checking anything. The text from Vienna had been deleted days ago, but the words still echoed in her mind like something unfinished. She drank her tea slowly, no sugar, and stared at the folder icon on her desktop, Halloween, private. It had sat there for weeks, a neat little container of logistics and approvals, a paper trail leading back to a truth only she knew. She'd thought about it every day since the message. Thought about the money, the anonymity, the way her mother would smile on the lawn of that estate, surrounded by people who only knew the glossy version of her. The version that didn't include Ilara, or Ray, or anything inconvenient. Her mother didn't want her there, didn't want questions, didn't want a face in the crowd that couldn't be controlled. And Ilara, she no longer wanted to be a silent sponsor for a story built on a mission. She walked to her desk, opened her laptop, and pulled up the contract one last time. Clause 6.3. It was simple. A few lines tucked between boilerplate language about event liability and tax disclaimers. It read, almost like an afterthought, the donor may terminate sponsorship without notice or liability if the event becomes misaligned with the donor's ethical or relational values. Ilara didn't hesitate. She opened a new message addressed to Jolene, the venue's senior event coordinator, and added the trust's finance manager in copy. Subject: withdrawal of sponsorship. Cartwright Winslow event. She typed each line deliberately, no edits. Per clause 6.3 of the sponsorship agreement STEM Equity Trust hereby revokes funding for the Cartwright Winslow wedding event at Hallwyn Estate effective immediately. Please suspend all access to dispersed funds and notify associated vendors of the cancellation. No further correspondence is necessary. She signed it, Ilara Winslow, Director of Programs, STEM Equity Trust. She hovered over the send button for exactly one breath, then clicked. It was quiet after that. Not ceremoniously quiet, just normal. The air didn't shift. Nothing trembled. There was no dramatic score rising behind her. But inside, something clicked into place like a key finally turning in the right lock. She minimized her inbox, opened the file folder on her desktop, scanned the subfolder's floor plans, floral quotes, lighting grids, RSVP rosters. Then she right-clicked the parent folder. Delete. The screen asked her to confirm. She clicked yes. The folder disappeared. No trace, no archive. No draft tucked away for just in case. It was gone. She closed her laptop and leaned back in the chair, letting her eyes rest on the ceiling. She hadn't told anyone. Not Ray. Not her assistant. Not the board. This wasn't about strategy. It wasn't even about justice, really. It was about refusal. Refusing to hold up someone else's illusion, refusing to be used as scaffolding for a woman who once told her to grow up, and then spent the next decade pretending the past had no weight. Vienna would wake up in a few days to a very different kind of problem. One that couldn't be fixed with florals or charm or a well-placed apology. And Alara wouldn't be there to explain it, wouldn't offer a reason, wouldn't give her a new narrative to spin. She didn't need Vienna to understand what she'd done. She just needed her to feel the absence sharp and undeniable, the same way she had all those years. The morning air was crisp, touched by spring, but still holding onto a trace of late winter chill. The Halwyn estate gleamed under the pale sun, but the usual hum of setup, the shuffle of vendors, the hiss of espresso machines warming up the clink of glassware was absent. Instead, the driveway remained eerily still save for the soft purr of town cars arriving one by one. The first guests stepped out in designer heels and polished loafers, adjusting shawls and checking phones, expecting to be ushered in with champagne flutes and smiles. Instead, they found a locked gate and a line of confused attendees forming along the gravel. Vienna arrived in the third car, her makeup-flawless hair swept into a soft chignon, the kind that took 2 hours and 3 stylists to get effortless. She stepped out gracefully in a cream silk robe, her custom gown protected in the garment bag, still draped across the back seat. Grant followed behind, adjusting his cufflinks jaw tight from too little sleep and too much pressure. His best friend Cole trailed them, carrying a small gift bag and glancing around for the event manager, but no one was there to greet them. Vienna's brows pinched the moment her heels clicked on the gravel. "Why are the gates still shut?" she asked, scanning the grounds. "We're 30 minutes behind call time." Cole checked his watch. No signage either. No staff. Grant pulled out his phone and started dialing. Just then, Jolene, the estate's senior coordinator, came rushing from the side path, tablet in hand, her blazer, slightly wrinkled eyes wide with something between confusion and disbelief. "Vienna," she said, breathless. This doesn't make sense. I'm still confirming, but something's wrong with the access codes. Nothing's unlocked." Vienna stiffened. "That's not possible. We confirmed vendor arrival at 7. "I know," Jolene said, scrolling frantically through her screen, "but the systems were frozen overnight, and when I logged in, this was flagged." She turned the tablet so Vienna could see the red notice across the booking platform. "Sponsorship revoked. Access suspended. Contract null. Issued 3:12 a.m. Thursday." Jolene looked up. "It says the funding entity pulled out 2 days ago. Effective immediately." Vienna blinked. "What are you talking about?" "There's no other funding entity. That's my name on the paperwork." Jolene shook her head. "Actually, it wasn't. The venue was underwritten by a third-party donor. You signed as host, not payee." Grant turned slowly. "Wait, what?" Vienna's voice cracked, just barely. "No, that's not there. It must be a mistake." Cole stepped forward. "So, there's no event." Whispers had started to swirl around the waiting guests, now half-heard phrases like, "Something's off, and I thought this was supposed to be an outdoor setup." People were pulling out their phones, texting, calling, trying to make sense of the silence. Jolene lowered her voice. "Vienna, I've worked with Halwyn for 6 years. I've never seen a contract vanish midweek. If a donor pulled funding and the contract relied on it, this is exactly what would happen. But you have a cancellation clause, don't you?" Vienna asked. "We've had deposits. Vendors. There's no way this just disappears." "There is if the clause was invoked for ethical misalignment," Jolene said. "It's rare, but it's there." And it was signed. Grant turned to Vienna. Jaw clenched. "You knew this was coming." "No," she snapped. "Of course not. I didn't even know there was a donor. I thought it was part of the trust's media partnership." Jolene looked between them. "I think you need to speak with whoever made that agreement, because this wedding isn't happening here. Not today." Vienna's skin went pale beneath her perfect foundation. She glanced out at the guests fidgeting at the gate, some already turning back toward their cars. Whispers were becoming murmurs. Murmurs, chatter. People noticed. People always noticed. Grant muttered something under his breath and stepped away to take a call. Vienna stood frozen. No tent, no chairs, no catering truck, no champagne tower, no monogrammed welcome signs, just 200 people and a gate that wouldn't open. She was used to rewrites. She was good at them. But, for once, the story was no longer hers to control. By Sunday afternoon, the story had already changed. It started with a carefully worded email blast. to all 213 invited guests, titled A Shift in Plans with Gratitude. It was sent from Vienna's personal assistant's email, written in that overly gracious tone people use when they're trying to sound both in control and entirely blameless. Due to a sudden and unfortunate fire code compliance issue at the Halwan estate, we were advised, just hours before our ceremony, that the venue could no longer accommodate guests. Rather than postpone what was meant to be a sacred day, we chose to celebrate privately, surrounded by our deepest intentions and closest energy. The message closed with a link to a black and white photo of Vienna and Grant, standing in front of what looked like a fireplace mantel. Vienna in the dress she'd spent months selecting, her hand resting lightly on Grant's chest. There were no guests in the photo. No flowers, no rings visible, just shadows and styling. It was all theater. A staged correction, a post-production fix to a story that had unraveled in public view. The truth, of course, was much messier, and it was already circulating online. By Monday morning, hashtags were surfacing: locked out wedding, Cartwright chaos. Guests had posted photos from the Halwan driveway, rows of cars lined up, people holding wrapped gifts and confused expressions. One particularly sharp video of a woman in a green wrap dress whispering, "This is not normal." There was no sign of Vienna engaging directly. She had someone scrubbing tags, someone else posting affirmations. A new Instagram post had gone up less than 24 hours after the failed ceremony. A shot of her feet in satin heels captioned, "Walked into the next chapter on my own terms." Ilara saw it all, quietly, from the edges. She didn't comment, didn't like or save or forward, but she read and watched and waited. People speculated. Some believed Vienna's story, others didn't, but it didn't take long for someone, an older woman, perhaps as a distant relative or a longtime family friend, to leave a comment on one of the now private wedding photos. Funny how things fall apart when you push away the only person who ever really cared. The comment got 7 likes before it disappeared, but not before Ilara saw it. She didn't feel satisfaction exactly. This wasn't vindication. It wasn't revenge. It was something colder, quieter. A removal of breath, like someone else had finally noticed the shape of the absence Vienna had spent a decade ignoring. It had never been about ruining the wedding. That would have implied she wanted to take something from her mother. But Ilara hadn't taken anything. She'd simply reclaimed what was hers, her voice, her effort, her choice, to no longer hold up the thing that had been built to exclude her. Let them believe the fire code excuse. Let them repost soft focus images of forgiveness and renewal. She knew the truth. Vienna knew it too, though she'd never admit it. Maybe not even to herself. Some part of her had to wonder as she stood in that dimly lit fireplace photo shoot where the guests had gone. Why the calls from vendors had stopped. Why the trust that had signed the checks had vanished like mist. Why the only person who had ever extended anything resembling grace, anonymously, quietly, had suddenly disappeared from the blueprint. Ilara didn't need to be thanked. She didn't even need to be mentioned. She just needed the silence to finally mean something. And now, for once, it did. It came on a Thursday afternoon, the kind of day that blurred into other stacked meetings, budget approvals, a postponed site visit to a girls' robotics lab in Detroit. Ilara was cleaning out her inbox between Zoom calls, sorting flagged messages from interns and vendor contracts when she saw it. Subject line, checking in. Sender Vienna, WinslowCoaching.com. She didn't open it right away, just stared at the preview text floating beneath the subject. Hope you're doing well. We all move on in our own ways. V. There was no salutation, no name, no subject of reference, just a tidy, non-committal sentence pretending to be kind. A diplomatic shrug dressed up as emotional labor. Ilara clicked it open more out of curiosity than hope. That was the entire message. One sentence. No mention of the wedding, no question, no context, and certainly no apology. And certainly no, not for the text that had told her not to come. Not for the years of silence, not for the erasure. Not for the story Vienna had told so many people, that Ilara had distanced herself, had held onto bitterness, had always taken her father's side. Just, we all move on in our own ways. as if they were two old colleagues who had drifted apart after a failed project, as if there hadn't been a foundation that collapsed because of her, as if Alara hadn't quietly, anonymously, graciously funded the image her mother had curated, only to be told she didn't belong near it. Spin. That's all it was. Vienna was testing the waters, not to make amends, not to reconcile, just to see if the door was still cracked open, if she could step back into the frame without consequence, without effort, and rewrite her way into forgiveness like she always had. Alara didn't reply. She didn't even finish reading it twice. She moved her mouse to the top of the screen and clicked mark as spam. Then she sat back and breathed out, not in sadness, but in relief. It was done. There would be no dramatic confrontation, no monologue, no final reckoning, just one woman trying to pretend the ground hadn't shifted under her, and another choosing not to invite her back into the room. The next time Alara spoke that day, it was to a group of young women over a video call, first-generation students from a Chicago public school presenting their prototype for an app that tracked safe routes to and from campus. She smiled, genuinely, clapped softly as they signed off, and told one girl her pitch could make her 6 figures by 30 if she kept at it. She didn't think about the email again. It didn't deserve more space than it already had. Some people speak with silence, others rewrite with absence. And some, goodbyes are never spoken aloud, just folded, neatly filed away, and never opened again. The chandeliers sparkled like they had before, casting warm light across the polished floor of the Halwyn Estate's grand ballroom. The same arches, the same stone terrace, the same floral scent drifting in from the courtyard. But this time, it was Alara's name on the welcome sign, her trust, her team, her story. 3 months had passed since the wedding that wasn't. No one at the venue mentioned it when the STEM Equity Trust reached out again, just polite professionalism, gratitude for renewed partnership, and an eagerness to host a gala designed for change, not vanity. Now, the room was filled with over 200 women, young engineers, scholarship recipients, educators, mentors, funders, the ones who built, who solved, who dreamed with spreadsheets and code and soldering wires instead of silk and champagne. They wore suits, dresses, sneakers. One girl had purple braids threaded with copper wire like circuitry. Another wore a hand-pinned name tag that read, Future NASA Systems Designer. Alara stood at the edge of the stage watching them find their seats. She didn't feel nervous. She didn't feel petty. She felt whole. The evening had gone smoothly, cocktails, soft jazz, a video reel of the year's program highlights. There had been laughter, clapping, a moment of silence for the founder whose early donations had seeded the trust. And now, it was her turn to speak. The MC called her name with practiced grace. She stepped onto the stage in a navy dress with pockets, intentional, quiet, functional. The applause rose. She waited a second before beginning, letting the energy settle. I've been asked why we chose this venue, she said into the mic, and it's a fair question. A soft ripple of laughter. She smiled. There's history here, and like most history, some of it's beautiful and some of it's complicated. But when I walked this space again months ago, I realized something. It's just a place. The meaning comes from what we bring into it. She looked out into the sea of faces, eager, kind, hungry for possibility. Tonight, she said, this room holds futures. You're not here because someone opened a door for you. You're here because you kicked it open, or cracked it, or waited for it and then rewired the lock. A cheer rose near the back, and she let it roll through the room before continuing. We fund ideas, yes. But more than that, we fund voice. Girls who've been told they're too quiet, too bold, too poor, too complicated girls who dare to build anyway. We don't write their stories. We give them tools to write their own. The room was quiet now, in that attentive, charged way. She closed simply. Some people stand on stages to be seen, others stand on them because they built the damn thing. Thank you for being here, for building with us. As she stepped down, the applause rose again, steady and full. She returned to her table without fanfare, accepted a few hugs, took a sip of water. Around her, conversations buzzed. Young women traded business cards. A robotics teacher from Arizona leaned in to connect a high schooler to an alum at Caltech. No one asked her about Vienna. No one mentioned weddings or headlines or scandal. This night wasn't about subtraction. It was about everything she had added, stitched together, lifted from nothing, and made real. Later, when most of the guests had trickled out and the venue staff began folding chairs and clearing plates, Alara stayed back. She wandered the edges of the ballroom, fingertips grazing linen eyes, catching light refracting through glass. Same place, different power. For once the stage wasn't borrowed, it was hers. The cabin was quiet when she arrived, tucked into a patch of maples that had just started to turn. Gold edged the leaves like someone had painted them in the slow strokes. Ray's truck was parked under the pines, same as always, a little rustier around the wheels, but still running, still steady. Alara knocked out of habit, even though he always told her to just walk in. The door creaked open, and the familiar scent hit her coffee old paper cedar wood. A fire crackled in the stone hearth, though the afternoon was still warm. Ray never liked cold creeping in. He was crouched by the hallway closet, surrounded by half-open boxes and a stack of old files. He looked up and smiled in that quiet, reliable way. "Didn't expect you until dinner. I made good time," she said, setting down her bag. Ray stood, brushed his hands on his jeans. "I was going through some storage. Thought you might want to look." She followed him to the table where a weathered box sat open, the cardboard soft from the years of being shifted, ignored. Inside were old photos, some faded, others still sharp family snapshots, vacation Polaroids, school portraits, and then, unmistakably, images of Vienna. Younger, flashier, laughing on a beach in a sarong, standing beside a car she hadn't paid for. One photo showed her in a red cocktail dress, arm looped around a man who wasn't Ray. "These were hers," he said gently. "Left them behind after she moved out. I didn't touch them." Alara picked up one of the photos and turned it over. On the back, written in Vienna's looping cursive, New Year's Eve, 2001. Everything starts fresh. There was a kind of cruelty in it now, not because it was celebratory, but because of how fully Vienna had believed it. That everything could be reset, rewritten, reinvented. Alara sifted through a few more. A birthday dinner at a restaurant she barely remembered. Vienna holding a wine glass mid-toast. Her smile always perfect, always performative. "You don't have to take them," Ray said. "Just figured I'd ask before tossing." Alara didn't answer right away. She gathered a small handful and held them for a moment. They felt heavier than they should. "I'll take care of them," she said quietly. Outside, the sun was starting to dip behind the ridge, painting the sky in soft orange light. Ray stayed inside, giving her space like he always did when she needed it. She walked out to the edge of the clearing where the fire pit sat mostly unused in summer. She knelt, placed the stack of photos into the pit one by one, not with anger, but with intention. She lit the match. The paper curled, quickly, edges turning black before folding in on themselves. The ink bubbled, cracked, disappeared. Vienna's smile vanished into smoke. Her red dress blurred into ash. The false beginning she'd tried to capture melted in silence. Alara didn't watch every piece burn. She stood and walked back toward the cabin, the fire hissing quietly behind her, already fading. She didn't need to see the last image turn to dust. She wasn't erasing the past. She was releasing it, not out of hate, not even out of grief, but because she didn't need to carry the story Vienna had written for herself anymore. She was writing her own. And this time, there was no space for make-believe. The last of the guests had filtered out, some with gift bags tucked under their arms, others lingering at the edges of the ballroom to hug their mentors or snap one final photo under the STEM Equity Trust banner. The music had been turned down, the dessert trays picked clean, and the staff had begun folding linen napkins with practiced efficiency. Outside, the sky was fading to ink, the estate bathed in soft amber light. Alara was near the back of the room helping a volunteer stack unused programs into a box when she noticed her. A girl, 16, maybe 17, hovering a few feet away, clutching her name badge in both hands like it was something fragile. She wore black slacks a little too long at the hem and a pale blue blazer that didn't quite fit across the shoulders. Her hair was braided into a simple crown, her face open and uncertain in the way of someone working up the courage to speak. Ilara smiled gently. "You don't have to be nervous." The girl stepped closer. Her voice was soft but steady. "Miss Winslow, can I ask you something?" "Of course." She hesitated. "Do you ever feel bad for walking away from family?" The question landed like a stone in still water, quiet but deep. Ilara took a slow breath, watching the girl's eyes the way they flicked down and back up like she expected judgment just for asking. "I used to," Ilara said, "but not for the reasons you think." The girl tilted her head slightly. "I don't feel bad for leaving," Ilara continued. "I feel bad that I stayed too long hoping something that was broken would suddenly start working just because I wanted it to." There was no bitterness in her tone, just truth smoothed over time. "I didn't walk away," she said. "I just stopped pretending it was something it wasn't." The girl nodded slowly as if letting the words settle in. She looked down again. "My sister says I'm selfish for applying to colleges out of state, that if I really cared about our family, I'd stay close." Ilara offered the kind of smile that doesn't fade with the moment. Sometimes the most caring thing you can do is grow into the version of yourself they refuse to see. The girl looked up. There was something like light in her eyes now, not clarity maybe, but possibility. "Thank you," she whispered. Ilara touched her arm gently. "You owe no one your silence, not even the people who raised you." The girl nodded again and walked away slowly at first. Then, with more certainty, Ilara stood there for a while longer, letting the weight of the question and the truth in her own answer settle across her shoulders like something earned. She thought of Ray still sorting through old boxes and always making space for who she was becoming. Of the women in the room tonight, engineers, coders, dreamers, some of them already breaking ceilings, some still learning how to lift their voices. She thought of the quiet fire in the pit behind his cabin and the photos curling into smoke. Some stories ended not with confrontation but with release. And sometimes what you build afterward is stronger because of what you walked away from. She turned back toward the staff, ready to help with the cleanup. Her steps light her path, her own. The ballroom was silent now. Tables cleared, chairs stacked, lights dimmed except for the soft amber glow above the stage. The scent of flowers still lingered faintly in the air, roses and eucalyptus clipped stems, and the ghost of a celebration now packed neatly into boxes. Ilara walked slowly through the room, heels echoing softly against polished floors. Her navy dress had loosened slightly at the waist after hours of wear, and her shoulders felt lighter than they had in years. She passed by a forgotten program near the last table, folded in half, someone's pen mark circling a girl's name under Rising Innovators. She smiled faintly and left it there. She made her way to the stage, stepping up with the ease of someone who had stood in that light and not shrunk from it. At the podium, she paused not to speak, not to rehearse, just to look. The room, even empty, felt full, of breath, of momentum, of something planted. She reached into her clutch and pulled out a small folded card, simple white, blank on the outside. She'd written it earlier during the final speech when no one was looking and her hands needed something to do. She unfolded it now and placed it gently at center stage, just beneath the warm pool of light where her voice had echoed only an hour ago. It read, "To the woman who taught me how to build a life by showing me what not to become." She didn't sign it. Didn't need to. The words were never meant to reach Vienna's hands. This wasn't a message for her. It was a closing gesture, a release. She looked around one last time. The chandeliers overhead glimmered dimly, the room quiet as breath held between heartbeats. She walked to the side of the stage, paused at the control panel, and turned the lights off one by one overhead, accent perimeter, until only the glow from the windows remained. And then, finally, she stepped through the doors and into the cool night air. No applause, no confrontation, just peace. The quiet kind, the kind you don't chase, but choose. The night air outside the Halwyn estate was crisp and still. Stars had begun to prick through the black sky above the hills, scattered like a map Ilara didn't need to follow anymore. She stood beneath the archway of the side entrance, the thick wooden door now closed behind her, the echo of its latch soft but final. Her heels pressed into the gravel path as she paused there just long enough to take one last breath of the place. She turned back briefly, eyes tracing the curve of the roofline, the quiet windows glowing dimly in the distance. The same venue, the same stage, the same stone terrace where not so long ago 200 guests had waited for a bride who never arrived. Only now it wasn't someone else's performance. The space had been rewritten not through revenge but through reclamation. Earlier that evening she had stood at the center of that ballroom under a spotlight she hadn't asked for and spoken not about herself but about the girls in the room, the ones she believed in more than legacy or bloodline or curated image. She hadn't mentioned Vienna, not even once. And yet the silence around her mother had carried more weight than any accusation could. Now, in the quiet, there was no audience, no one left to impress or confront. Just Ilara and the truth she had carried alone for far too long. She reached into her coat pocket and pulled out a second card, smaller than the one she'd left on the stage, just a scrap of thick stationery folded once, neatly. No decoration, no envelope. She crouched by the stone ledge beside the steps and set it down carefully just beneath the bronze plaque that read Founding Venue Partner, the same plaque Vienna had posed beside in her early wedding planning photos, the one that had appeared in her Instagram post with the caption Where New Stories Begin. The card didn't need a flourish, it just said, She didn't know I funded it. And now she never will. Ilara stood slowly brushing her coat sleeve smooth again. It wasn't bitterness that moved her. It hadn't been for a long time. It was something else, something deeper. The choice to walk away, not because she had lost, but because she had outgrown the space that once tried to contain her. She turned, toward the lot, the gravel crunching softly beneath her steps. A few distant lights flickered inside where the cleaning crew had begun packing the last of the chairs. No one noticed her leaving. No one needed to. She reached her car, unlocked it, and slipped behind the wheel. She didn't start the engine right away, just sat there, hands on the wheel eyes forward. For the first time in years, her body felt light, not because something had been erased, but because she had finally stopped carrying what was never hers to hold. Vienna would tell her story however she wanted. She always had, but this one, the truth of it, the weight and the quiet power, it belonged to Ilara, and she didn't need anyone to know it to make it real. She started the car. The headlights cut across the trees. She drove forward, no rear-view glances. The chapter had already closed, and this time she wasn't in it.